We really have a good one this week. The Beguiled is a movie that I can truly get excited about, a movie that really surprised me. Yes, it has some enormous flaws. Enormous flaws. I would not recommend it to everybody, but this is a movie like no other. The kind of movie that this channel is made for, really. I truly think, yeah, a movie like no other. In fact, it's hard to even describe what The Beguiled is. Typically, it's just introduced as the big outlier in Clint Eastwood's career. Or is that Every Which Way But Loose? Or maybe it's Paint Your Wagon? Well, this movie is more off the wall than both of those movies combined. It's a lot more interesting. It's more substantive. Clint Eastwood, yes, he's an essential part of the movie, and his star power is key to the movie. I'm not sure it would work without him or someone like him. We'll talk all about the casting in a second. But this movie is a lot bigger than any one actor. It's a lot more than an odd stopover for Clint Eastwood fans. This is one of the most interesting movies I've seen this year. Yes, the first 20 minutes I thought, what the heck is this? Let's stop watching it. But once this movie gets going, man, what a movie. And I have a lot to say. A lot to say about it. The basic premise of The Beguiled isn't too hard to explain. Clint Eastwood is a Union soldier who is wounded and discovered by a student at a nearby girls' school. We're in the South here, but the women at the school begrudgingly take him in and help him heal. Then the movie turns into a bit of a bodice ripper, a twisted Southern Gothic story with a taut love pentagon at the center of it. Now, if you look at the poster, the original poster for this movie is Clint Eastwood in the middle with his gun, front and center, right? And I think a lot of people were probably expecting an action movie when they wandered into theaters in 1971. No surprise this was a bit of a flop because, wow, they were in for a shock. There are some intense scenes, but this movie is not one thing. It's not an action movie. It sort of doesn't fit with anything Eastwood has done, although it kind of does. The movie is a cross between many different things, very hard to pin down. And for me, that's one of the first things that excites me. In some big ways and in some subtle ways, this movie just doesn't feel like much else. The only thing that came to mind when I was watching it is Picnic at Hanging Rock, which has kind of a similar setting. And in truth, this girls' school or convent that's a little bit spookier, a little bit haunted, there's plenty of movies about that. But this, it's a bit different. I have a video about Picnic at Hanging Rock, of course. Anyway, this stuff that I've already said, it's got Clint Eastwood in it. That's about the only thing that's easy to say about The Beguiled. From here on out, we got to be real switched on. We got to be really discerning because this, wow, a doozy of a movie. It is extreme, it's ambiguous, it's strange. But hey, what could be more exciting than that? So rather than run through the plot of the whole movie, I think it's a lot more interesting to talk about the dramatic logic, how these gears actually turning, how the movie works. And it's interesting here, too, because we have some unorthodox drama in the movie, I guess. To begin with, Clint Eastwood's character, John McBurney, that's his name, McB, they call him sometimes. Well, he's a soldier behind enemy lines. That's not too complicated to understand, I guess. He's also wounded, right? He is vulnerable. And Clint Eastwood actually is often wounded in movies. Part of Clint Eastwood's star context is a sense of righteousness. Yes, he is a tough guy and a macho guy, and sometimes a little bit of an unhinged anti-hero in some ways. But he's also strangely principled. Very precise balance to strike. And that's one of the things that's sort of interesting about a movie like Dirty Harry is how they can sort of combine this righteousness with this kind of disregard of society in some ways. One thing that can fit into that is him being a victim, him being out for the count. Another thing that you see in a lot of his movies is him being hesitant to be violent or something like that, like in Gran Torino, waiting to do anything for quite a while. 2 pages from his book. But yeah, here he starts out on the back foot. We see something very similar in The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, for instance. There's a long period of that movie where he's down and out. In Paint Your Wagon, even, he has to rely on the kindness of strangers at one point. Well, here he starts on the verge of death. And the first big dynamic in the movie is that he's saved by the women at the school. Or are they about to turn him in? Maybe they'll take him in now, but they'll turn him in tomorrow. One specific dramatic mechanism here is the blue rag. You don't know what the blue rag is? Well, okay. The women at the school can tie a blue rag to the front gate of their compound to signal the Confederate patrols that pass by each day, I guess, that there's a Union soldier in the area, that they need help or something like this. So, are we going to see the blue rag on the gate? Or not? Great little, dramatic mechanism. We're also taught the system that the school uses to keep watch. There's a girl always on duty on the roof who's keeping lookout, scanning back and forth, although sometimes just reading a book and not paying attention. If they see something, they have a system of pulleys that rings a big makeshift bell downstairs, right? So they'll pull the rope and it'll ring the bell. And of course, once we learn how this works, we're bound to hear that bell later on. These are some really clever, somewhat unconventional mechanics. There's a bunch of them throughout the movie. A film that ends up being quite gripping despite not having a very conventional plotline. Okay, now unfortunately as we meet the women, we're introduced to another dramatic mechanic, and this one sucks. We get a little bit of internal monologue in voiceover from each of the characters. This is a huge own goal, and I wish they hadn't done it. But it does at least completely telegraph one of the next angles in the film, which is that many of the women at this school are attracted to this handsome soldier. They're living in a big worn-down plantation-style home together, no men around. Some of them have no interest in the enemy, but most of them do. And this is, let me tell you, quite a steamy movie. This was one of the first things that surprised me, is just how raunchy the film is, partly for being set in the Civil War, but also for being from 1971. Well, I guess it was a time of liberation. There are some caveats to the romance. We'll talk a little bit about some of the messages behind all this stuff later on. But either way, there's a bunch of drama that arises as multiple women become interested in this one guy in a house with very thin walls. There are lots of dramatic mechanisms here, too. One person overhearing another. People sneaking away, saying, I'll be right back, but they go somewhere else. And, well, each night the sun sets, and there's the promise of some tryst with somebody, but who's it going to be? So, again, lots of really clever mechanisms here. This romantic angle creates a bunch of pressure inside of the school, of course. This opens up questions about who's in charge, how's the school run. We also start to realize that the school itself is vulnerable. Maybe the rebels will stop by. Maybe the Confederates aren't that great either. So just like McBurney is trapped, so are the women at the school. There start to be a lot of angles to this movie, and most of them are going to swing back and forth a couple of times, at least. Here, we're only talking about trying to figure out what's going to happen, right? How will this turn out? But most movies have another aspect of drama in them, which concerns what should happen, what we want to happen, who we should root for, the moral balance of this film. And the moral balance of this film is another thing that swings wildly back and forth, which is great. This is where the movie really starts to move through the gears, in fact. Of course, we begin by probably assuming that Clint Eastwood is a good guy, trying to endear himself to the women at the school, although there is a very strange occurrence in the first 30 seconds of the movie that might make you feel otherwise. But you're probably going to assume that he's, trying to be nice to these people because he's nice. Oh, also he wants to survive. Is he taking advantage of these women? Is he putting them on? McBurney's moves, his backstory of being a Quaker medic who was wounded while trying to help a fellow soldier, does it all seem a little bit too good to be true? Is he sincere? Well, this is where the casting really starts to work some wonders. Of course, Clint Eastwood has often played anti-heroes, and you could argue that that's the same thing that's happening here, but I think they take things a little bit farther and basically completely reverse a lot of the lines that you would hear Clint Eastwood say in most of his movies. He's using his star power, he's using his charm, but it's a little bit insincere, disingenuous. This movie is called The Beguiled, so presumably this is one of the main ideas. And maybe there is some beguiling being done by other parties as well, but with Clint Eastwood being kind of sleazy, I guess, being kind of insincere, being a liar, potentially, is he? We have a big extra-textual thing happening, a huge tension between what you would expect and, really swings the moral balance of the film. You start probably pulling for him, but is this going to last? Well, this is only the beginning of the switcheroos. I think even the most loyal viewers, I've noticed that in watching movies, some people need to latch on to some characters more than other people, right? And there's no judgment here, but I find that some people are just more likely to attach themselves to a character and be loyal to them. Well, even the most loyal viewers here are going to be scratching their heads by the end of the movie. Who the heck? What do we even want to happen? And what did happen? Oh, and I forgot to mention, by the way, this school has a couple of slaves who develop an interesting relationship with McBurney. So, There's a theme of freedom, I guess, a lack of freedom, vulnerability, power that cuts across the whole movie, and perhaps is symbolized by a crow with a broken wing that the girls tie to a railing of the balcony. Are they healing this bird? Are they harming it? Anyway, hopefully it was useful to enunciate all these different dynamics. I find myself needing to unpack what exactly happened in this movie. It's the kind of thing you finish up and your hair's blown back a little bit. It's a little overwhelming. I mention these things pretty abstractly, but this is an extreme movie. Of course, there have been more extreme movies made in the 54 years since this one, but still, The Beguiled really took me for a ride. This is a surprisingly metal movie, a somewhat shocking movie, and an unforgettable movie. Let's talk a little bit about the style and the people who made this thing possible. I think that will help us wrap our heads around things. We're still just trying to answer the question of what even is this, to some extent, or at least I'm still trying to answer this, right? The movie starts out with some stills from the war. It pans across them, a la Ken Burns, though he was not making movies yet. It's got everything in a bluish black and white, and we stick with this color scheme for the opening moments and the closing moments of the live action sequences as well. So we're kind of setting things up to be a big historical movie. The opening credits are accompanied by a bunch of sounds from battle, but we see that the score is from Lalo Schifrin. For me, this was the first hint that something weird was going to happen. Lalo Schifrin, his real name was Boris, by the way, he's not the guy that I think of for historical films. He's the guy you go to when you want a jazzy, upbeat, but kind of unsettling score, maybe with a lot of drumming in it, right? If you've been living under a rock for the last 60 years, he wrote the music for Mission Impossible, one of the greatest theme songs ever. That's in 5/4. But also, if you've watched the TV show, the rest of the music in it, too, is great. Tons of sort of unsettling incidental and just secondary themes in that. Swinging, but also kind of eerie. Really classic sound of that era. Is he about to bring that, modern sound to a movie that's set in the Civil War? Sort of, yes. The score for this movie is great, though, it turns out. I was skeptical about it, partly because the opening credits are kind of abrasive, and then the first melodies that you hear when Amy's walking through the woods, they seemed a little cheesy, but from then on out, the score of this is fantastic, and it's an interesting hybrid of some more classical sounding music, somewhat gothic stuff, with the hybrid of like classic gothic music with something more modern. The unsettling sounds of Mission Impossible, a little bit of the atonal stuff that was also big at the time, atonal score. I think the first one was the Planet of the Apes really kicked that off. Parts of the score remind me of Ennio Morricone, who Eastwood had a big connection with, of course. Other parts of it remind me more of what you'd hear in the Twilight Zone, something twisted. And you know what? That kind of sums up the movie. Gothic, a little bit macho, twisted, and a trip into the Twilight Zone. You might go into this movie thinking that it's going to be a historical film, looking at the psyche of a soldier and the sexual politics of war, but not really. And the music is a hint that the movie is playing a much more modern game. Another hint at this is all the anachronisms in the film, and you may have picked up on this already, but it's pretty obvious when you watch the movie. In the very beginning, Amy, this is the student who finds McBurney, well, when she finds him, the first thing she says is, "Oh my God," in a way that it just really does not track with the Civil War. Then McBurney asks Amy how old she is, and when she says 12, he gives her a kiss on the lips to keep her quiet as the soldiers pass by. Just a few seconds into the movie, and you already might not really know what to make of it. Anyway, the cinematography is by Bruce Surtees. This was the first film that he shot, but he would go on to do a bunch of movies with Clint Eastwood. The look in this movie is really cool. Very earthy. Maybe the colors at the beginning are a gimmick, but I like how much sort of natural light there is in this movie. There are a couple of sequences with off-the-wall style. There's a great dream sequence in the movie. Man, I wish I could tell you what happens, but you'll have to see for yourself. It's great. There's lots of crossfades in the movie. There are also some flashbacks. These are not my favorite part. I kind of wish you could delete them. There is some semi-important information that's sort of given to you, a bit ambiguous, but you sort of learn some things from them. There are a couple of really dynamic handheld shots in the movie, too. Doing a handheld shot in the 1970s is bold. It's basically guaranteed to look terrible, to look like it was filmed in an earthquake or something. But in the right circumstances, it can work. And the ones here are pretty good. Somehow we've yet to mention the director, Don Siegel. Like Surtees, Don Siegel might be mainly thought of as a guy who made a bunch of movies with Clint Eastwood, but I think there's more to him, and I want to see some more of his movies. He made the Invasion of the Body Snatchers from the 1950s, which I've seen. That's quite an interesting movie. And guess what? He directed a couple episodes of The Twilight Zone. Don Siegel mainly made noir films, I think, and then later they became neo-noir films, such as this one. Well, not really, but it's interesting to think about that legacy. Don Siegel is a director that, I think I might be taking a little more seriously from now on, although he said, I think, that this was his best movie. Anyway, stylistically, the highlight is probably just the tension in the movie. There are some really cutting scenes, some really taut stuff, some scenes that are just put together perfectly with the dialogue, really exacting. Let's make a quick note on the cast before we move on. Clint Eastwood is the most recognizable person in the movie by far, especially today. And this kind of doubles down on the extra textual element I mentioned before. McBurney wakes up in the school, and it feels like, well, okay, it's time for Clint Eastwood to go to work. Let's see the Hollywood charm. Like, Henry Fonda trying to convince 11 angry men he has his work cut out for him. The women in the movie don't have the same kind of star feel. That said, Geraldine Page is really good as the head mistress. And she actually was relatively well known, probably the third most famous Geraldine in Hollywood, but she had a big pedigree on the stage. And that, I think, maps really well onto her character, actually. A character that, as the headmistress, expects a certain amount of respect, but sort of comes from another world. I don't know. I think it works. Elizabeth Hartman is also in the movie, playing another romantic interest. The film was the beginning of an affair with Clint Eastwood and Hartman, I think. She had a tough life after that, and we may revisit her career and her life in a future video. Again, I actually think this is great casting. Let's get back to the themes, though. Like I said, this is probably not a historical film. I have a feeling that the main energy of the movie has a lot more to do with the sexual proclivities of the 1960s than those of the 1860s. I think the movie is probably defined more by its audience than by its subject, which is fine. Ultimately, this movie was probably something to provoke, titillate, and resonate with people in 1971. It is almost verging on exploitation at times. I'm reminded of a conversation in the movie that McBurney has with one of the domestic servants, one of the slaves in the film. When he first meets her, he says, hey, we should be friends because, I'm a Union soldier, right? Well, she doesn't really buy this at all. She tells him that actually, he's the one who's enslaved. And look, I don't know how people felt about this in the 1860s, but when I heard this conversation, this dialogue, it had a 1960s ring to it. You know what I mean? The idea of a white savior who doesn't quite get it, two parties finding themselves thrown together on an issue, but they're not really together. They don't really understand each other. I think that was in the zeitgeist in 1971. This movie, in many ways, I think is speaking to 1971. Now, does the movie have something particular to say here about race? I'm not sure. Does it have something particularly to say about anything? Maybe. The movie does at first seem kind of didactic. For instance, it seems like maybe it's got something to say about men and women. When we start to see the women in the school falling for McBurney, is that a frank and almost liberating look at women's desire? There aren't a lot of movies from the period, or even from now, with a cast that is mostly women. So it's tempting to think that something progressive is afoot. But you could also see the cattiness and the drama in the movie as a vestige of a much older movie and a much older stereotype. A little hard to know. Before you're able to make up your mind about this, the movie takes about 25 left turns in a row, and you wake up thinking, what the heck did I just watch? By the end, I think you kind of forget about the didactics. Similar thing with race. There is a thematic coherence here, nonetheless. There are some ideas, but the morals are a little unclear, maybe. I mentioned, for instance, the ideas with power and imprisonment. They're here, but I don't know if it's didactic. There is maybe one didactic angle which survives the movie, maybe, and that's some kind of anti-war stance. Clint Eastwood hums an anti-war song at the beginning of the movie, and he hums it again at the end. Now, as varied as Clint Eastwood's politics might be, it's pretty well known that he was against war. A bold stance, didn't like war. Clint Eastwood was drafted for the Korean War, I think, and he was against the Vietnam War. I'll leave it to you to decide how American Sniper fits into that, but you can imagine that they were setting out to make an anti-war movie. I kind of forgot about this until the very end. Oh, yeah. The Horrors of War. Is this a movie about the horrors of war? Well, it's about some things that happened during a war, but I don't know. I don't know exactly. I think they might whiff on this moral as well. And overall, I'm just not sure there is a clear didactic thrust to the movie. Having said that, there are themes. There are themes that do linger. For instance, we get a sense of a vestigial society, a society that has been scooped out by the war. There's no men around. It's kind of dire straits. And yet, the school's still giving lessons on manners, finishing lessons or whatever, teaching people how to hold a napkin. There's a huge contrast between this domestic life and the life of the men. In the army, when the patrols come by, they look super ragged. Even the difference between the school and a farm. The headmistress, at one point, contemplates shutting down the school due to lack of tuition and returning to farming. Isn't education important? Isn't it like crucial piece? Or is this place really just a business and maybe society will shift out from under it? There's something we're learning about the society, is what I'm trying to say. Something we see of it under these stripped back circumstances. One thing that symbolizes this a little bit is the house itself, which is a big plantation style sort of mansion. It was filmed at a real place, by the way. It's quite a fancy house, but it looks totally run down in the movie, and it's only certain parts of the interior that hint at what this place was. That's one theme. Another theme is morality itself and how flimsy it is as a currency, I guess. You might think that during a war, it would be obvious what to do when you encounter the enemy. But no. One of the students is vehemently against aiding and abetting McBee, but the others are pretty uncertain, while some of them are really in favor of it. Interestingly, these students are receiving a religious education at the time. Won't that tell them what to do? Apparently not. Now, I don't think this movie is actually that cynical about religion or about morality. It doesn't even seem to be making any claims about who should win the war. Sometimes in these movies, you get some dramatic irony about, like, oh, look how bad the Confederates are. But this movie doesn't actually do that much of that. But it does capture some personal doubts and uncertainties of faith, the personal journey of faith, the private turmoils of the war. One thing that represents this a little bit is a painting that hangs in the headmistress's room. And I should have looked up what this painting is. I don't know. But it's some kind of religious imagery that is surprisingly moving. A great detail in this movie. Also, it's interesting that between these paintings and the stills at the beginning of the film, there are a handful of images in the movie. Okay. I think that's most of what I have to say about The Beguiled. I'm grappling around here. I'm struggling a little bit. Maybe you can tell. If they just scratched the voiceover of this movie and done the flashbacks with a little more discernment, The Beguiled, wow, would be great. As it is, I still like it a lot. I will admit that part of the appeal is just that it makes you say, whoa, what the heck? What was that? And, yeah, it's not exactly an accessible movie if you don't have your mind wide open. But, hey, if you've seen a lot of movies and are looking for a weird one or an interesting one, The Beguiled is, yeah. It's absolutely that. If you've seen the movie, let me know. I can imagine it being somewhat polarizing, but at least for me, I really had fun watching this.